Assessing the legacy of Rabbi, Professor, Lord Jonathan Sacks is certainly a growing field. As one of the representative British speakers here, who studies Judaism in Britain and, I think we have to admit for my sins, the role of the chief rabbinate in providing leadership to the community, my particular interest is in considering how, building on some of the ideas that were introduced yesterday, how Rabbi Sacks' tenure as chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth, the rather unwieldy formal title of his office, helped or hindered him in developing his legacy. What role did it play in his religious leadership, his moral messaging, and his ability to influence the Jewish community? I think it's reasonable to suggest that it was his role as chief rabbi that offered Sacks a springboard to project a moral voice onto a global stage. The period of his chief rabbinate encompassed considerable shifts within British Jewry, as well as in the wider British, Jewish, and indeed Western context more broadly. Recognising how these shifts, which appear to be moving us towards what Hava, I think, appropriately characterised yesterday as a post-secular society, called for the input of moral spokespersons, disseminating a message on how to construct kinder, less polarised, antagonistic, lonely societies. Sacks embraced this role. Yet one of the central questions I'm interested in examining is, what influence can a chief rabbi in fact hope to exert? How are we to assess the impact he had? And on which community should we focus in seeking to analyse the role he played in shaping contemporary discourse on Judaism, religion, or indeed morality more broadly conceived? As he was approaching retirement from the British chief rabbinate, when asked in an interview to reflect on his own understanding of the legacy he thought he was leaving behind, he suggested British Jewry was increasingly becoming, quote, a community that is able to walk tall. I think we are much more active, exuberant, self-confident than we were, end quote. I would argue that the moral voice Rabbi Sacks successfully acquired on a national and subsequently international stage, outside a solely Jewish context, contributed to the growing confidence that these comments point towards within British Jewry. Nevertheless, a central premise of my paper is that, first, the nature of the British chief rabbinate imposes severe limits on the scope for exerting meaningful influence within the Jewish community. Second, in certain respects, though by no means all, Sacks' legacy can be better understood by considering how he followed the model of his predecessor, the person after whom the building that we're holding this conference is named, Emanuel Jacobowitz, who helped to establish a link between serving as chief rabbi and being elevated to a peerage. For both men, entering the House of Lords reflected the wider moral voice that they managed to acquire in British society. My contention is that this helps indicate how the nature of the chief rabbinate, in fact, encourages its incumbents to look outside the Jewish community in order to acquire any meaningful access to authority and influence, and to establish a platform for disseminating religious views. In 1970, shortly after Jacobowitz became chief rabbi, the United Synagogue marked its centenary with a variety of celebrations. One of the primary mainstream Orthodox institutions in British Jewry, the United Synagogue underpins and is closely interrelated with the office of chief rabbi. The historical development of both bodies has in many ways been defined by the inclusive, umbrella model that they each sought to uphold. This itself is best understood as a Jewish response to the central role played by the Church of England as the formal, established religion in Britain. The impetus towards centralisation and the influence this has exerted over British society as a whole is perhaps helpfully demonstrated by the statistical analysis that was recently released from the 2021 census. This recorded how, for the first time since the census has been collating data on religious identity, the proportion of those identifying as Christians in purportedly Christian Britain has dropped below 50%. In certain respects, reflecting the broader societal shifts that created the framework in which Sacks' moral leadership was welcomed, the fact that those willing to identify as having, quote, no religion, has grown to become the second most popular response, rising to 37%, is unsurprising. It reflects trends observed in many societies shaped by Western influences. At the same time, the retained hold of some form of Christian identity over almost half of British society for so long helps tell us something about the dominant approach to religious identity in Britain and the important role this has played in shaping the lives of British Jews. In particular, it indicates how inclusivism, a broad church theology emphasizing what values are shared instead of prioritizing potential boundary markers, has tended to flourish among religious groups in Britain. Notwithstanding this historical context, at the centenary celebrations for the United Synagogue, Jacobowitz made a point of referencing the Chafetz Chaim's warning that in the middle of the road only horses walk. What this comment helps to indicate is how, as chief rabbi, Jacobowitz served as a somewhat polarizing leadership figure. He often favorably commented on how Newton's laws of physics could equally be applied to religious life. Any moves to increase religiosity at one end of a religious scale could inevitably be expected to result in a corresponding shift at the opposite end of the scale. If this meant synagogue membership figures declined at the expense of greater commitment from those who remained, in Jacobowitz's view, this was no bad thing. The gains outweighed the losses. By contrast, when Rabbi Sachs was appointed as Jacobowitz's successor, in certain respects it was driven by an effort to try to repair some of the communal divisions that had grown during the chief rabbinate of his predecessor. Retrieving the model of inclusivism that had played such a central role in Anglican Britain, shaping British Jewry along the way, on assuming the role of chief rabbi, Sachs set out a vision for a decade of renewal. His first publication was entitled, "Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? Jewish Continuity and How to Achieve It?" However, examining some of the challenges he faced as he pursued his Jewish continuity project, and other elements of the lofty ideas he sought to implement, it's hard to ignore how, repeatedly, many of them became shipwrecks in what at times proved to be the rather stormy communal seas of his chief rabbinate. Part of my argument, though, is that it's the very nature of the office of chief rabbi that contributed to these challenges. One of the deep-rooted structural difficulties of the British chief rabbinate, itself, if we're honest, a relic of Victorian religiosity, is that its incumbent is beholden to a multitude of constituencies who simply cannot all simultaneously be served by the same individual with a single agenda. Perceptions that the chief rabbi speaks as the religious spokesperson of British Jewry are all too easy to imply, and consequently functions as a continuing source of discontent within sectors of the Jewish community. Although efforts have been made to clarify that the office of chief rabbi makes no claim to represent all the varied groups that make up the Jewish community in Britain, the nature of the post invariably helps establish its incumbent as the first port of call when any religious views are sought on behalf of British Jewry. Under these conditions, the nature of the post can impede rather than enhance opportunities to provide leadership. On one level, this creates difficulties in trying to assess Rabbi Sachs' legacy within British Jewry. A central recurring message in his theology was the imperative of appreciating how Judaism is a religion of action. Quote, Jewish faith is not primarily about creeds or theologies. It is not faith thought, but faith lived. On Shabbat we live creation, learning Torah we live revelation, performing acts of chesed, covenantal love, we live redemption. We do not philosophize about these things, we enact them. End quote. On these terms, the challenges he faced in putting theory into practice within the Jewish community point to certain limits in his religious leadership of the Jewish community in Britain. Yet, this draws me back to the central question of my paper, which asks how much Sachs, or indeed Jacobowitz before him, were really able to shape rather than just respond to the shifting religious trajectory of British Jewry. The period spanned by their two chief rabbinates, from 1967 to 2013, was a time of immense cultural change. How much they were able to alter or even somewhat influence the tides of these changes is, I think we have to acknowledge, beyond the scope of what I can cover in this paper. Nonetheless, what both leaders undoubtedly shared was a strong sense that their rabbinic role established them as heirs to the biblical prophets. It was this understanding that drove them to promulgate a moral message on a wider stage, to critique and offer guidance regarding the societal changes taking place. The subtitle of the volume Chava edited, devoted to Jonathan Sacks in the Brill series on contemporary Jewish philosophers, as she commented yesterday, is tellingly subtitled Universalizing Particularity. Given the inherent limits of the office of Chief Rabbi, a striking feature of how his thought developed as he progressed from his earlier more internally focused particularist rather than later more externally focused universalist work is the move in his later book-length publications to emphasize a capacious monotheistic message. The post-secular societal shifts that Sacks turned his attention to address, which created the moral vacuum calling out for some form of religious leadership, functioned as an important contributory factor in making the wider community outside British Jewry theoretically more receptive to his ideas. And it was striking during his chief rabbi, when the post of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, there was a remarkable letter in the Daily Telegraph newspaper suggesting that the ideal candidate was surely Jonathan Sacks. In some ways, the Victorian-era model of a broadly monocultural English respectability, which incorporated and built upon a sense of Christian godliness, was already in retreat during Jacobowitz's chief rabbi. Yet what Rabbi Sacks understood was how to use emerging multimedia tools and masterful rhetorical style to draw people into his narrative. He often commented on the central role of stories in the biblical canon. Quote, when the Hebrew Bible wants to explain something, it does not articulate a theory, it tells a story. End quote. This was a model on which he built. As he himself often recounted, it was his experiences of meeting with the Rav, the Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that set him on his religious journey. In his telling, quote, Rabbi Soloveitchik had challenged me to think, Rabbi Schneerson had challenged me to lead, end quote. His account of how to achieve these goals grew in large part from the distinction he drew between Torah and Chokhmah, which helps highlight the critical role that Shimshon Raphael Hirsch also played in shaping his thought as he read the original also. In a succinct account of the interrelations of Torah compared to worldly wisdom, Sacks explained, quote, without Torah, we cannot understand the Jewish story, but without Chokhmah, we cannot understand the human story. Not just the validity, but the obligation, at least on some level, of adopting a Torah in Derech Eretz theology was central to Sacks' thinking. The shared focus Hirsch and Sacks directed towards Torah commentaries offers a notable parallel. This prioritization of the biblical text, rather than rabbinic sources, itself seems to indicate how influences from the Derech Eretz helped shape their approaches to Torah, since it's Tanakh that functions as a shared scriptural canon for Jews and Christians, even if its meanings are doubtless interpreted quite differently. Although priority was undoubtedly given to Torah in order to engage with Chokhmah, for both Hirsch and Sacks, their account of the Jewish mission to the nations of the world, universalizing the particularist message of monotheistic Jewish beliefs, helped to elevate an engagement with Judaism that embraced an outward rather than primarily inward, internal focus. As Rabbi Sacks explained his position in future tense, a delicate balancing act subsequently lay at the heart of his theology, which he transmitted through his wide corpus of writings, public lectures, and creative use of other media. Quote, a basic duality runs through Judaism, shaping its view of the world. It honors both the universality of the human condition and the particularity of Jewish faith. So the Torah contains two stories, one from Adam to Noah, the other from Abraham to Moses. It contains two covenants, one with all humanity, the other with the people of Israel. There are two different names of God. There are two manifestations of God, one in creation, the the other in revelation, and there are two forms of knowledge, Chokhmah and Torah. Neither displaces nor supersedes the other. To be a Jew is to be both. We are part of humanity and its story, and we are children of Abraham and Sarah and their story. End quote. Reflecting his growing sense of the role he had to play on a global stage, and in the process, somewhat acknowledging the challenges of trying to exert an influence within British Jewry, his focus shifted in certain respects, as he championed a religious message that could be more widely disseminated. The heart of this message is perhaps best encapsulated in the previously referenced, wildly popular TED Talk, in which he encouraged individuals, quote, to do a search and replace operation from the text of your mind. Wherever you encounter the word self, substitute the word other. Instead of self-help, other. Instead of self-esteem, other-esteem, end quote. What he suggested was that such an exercise, quote, might just change your life and it might just help to begin to change the world. The thrust of his argument was that society has lost sight of the values necessary to sustain it. Prioritization of the self, the individual, has been pursued without sufficiently appreciating the costs it entails. Quote, the market is about the choosing eye, the liberal democratic state is about the voting eye, the economy is about the consuming eye, but I, like Adam long ago, is lonely. Individualism fosters loneliness, undermining the established institutions of our societies, helps create uncertainty and associated angst. In the concomitant battle between science and religion, Sachs noted how the focus has inappropriately been directed towards trying to make sense of what is rather than what ought to be. But in those terms, it's easy to see how a religious consciousness can underpin the nurturing of kinder, more sustainable societies. And a recurring feature of Sachs's outward-facing message was consequently to emphasize the imperative of looking beyond personal freedom so that, as he explained in his final book, Morality, it could become easier to, quote, relearn many of the moral habits that came so naturally to our ancestors, but have come to seem so strange to us. This outward-facing moral message played to Sachs's strengths, disseminating lofty ideals in engaging oratory that could draw people in. Despite emphasizing the role of action in Judaism, his experiences as chief rabbi helped indicate his struggle to progress from ideas to practical implementation, yet, recognizing the moral malaise and post-secular context of the age, he grew as a leadership figure seeking to set out theoretical models for engaging with these challenges. In these efforts, the office of chief rabbi helped open doors, enabling him to address the crises of the age. In this sense, he was able to use the chief rabbinate to set out varied accounts of how to respond to these crises, where he struggled, and what the role of chief rabbi anyway limited him from being was a hands-on leadership figure who was clearly able to proceed from rhetoric to defending the halachic arguments that could allow him within the Jewish community to implement practical processes for effecting change. Yet here, a final point, beyond the purview of my paper to fully consider, is worth noting. I've suggested that we can identify a shift in focus that develops in Sachs's book-length publications. Some of his more challenging experiences of religious leadership within British Jewry helped encourage him to turn his attention outwards, to articulate what were anyway important components of his theology, responding to the yearning on a bigger stage beyond British Jewry for a religious voice addressing some of the questions of the post-secular age. At the same time, he worked on an additional strategy for disseminating his theology in a Jewish medium in a manner that allowed him to circumvent the practical challenges of the chief rabbinate while setting out many of his arguments on the role of peoplehood, community, morality, and the interplay between Torah and Chokhmah. This was achieved through his translations and commentaries on the literature, his Siddur, his Machzorim, and Haggadah. By offering an alternative to art scroll, his partnership with Koren is helping to spread his legacy significantly. Would Koren have formed this partnership with him solely as principal of Jews College? Whatever struggles he faced in his practical leadership within British Jewry, and despite the considerable limits that the office of chief rabbi imposes, the library of works he's left behind behind, indicates how he did find alternative means of exerting influence, both to a Jewish and much wider audience.
Thank you very much. Our